The light came first not as a color, but as a change in the cold. It was the gray, mean hour before dawn on Whisper Ridge, a time when the high desert held its breath and the air was thin enough to slice a man's lungs. The land itself was shades of bruised purple and coyote gray, and standing against that bruised sky, silent as the rock they stood on, were 70 Apache warriors. They were not a war party, not in the way the broadsheets back east would paint them. They carried no lances meant for striking. They wore no paint for battle. They simply sat their ponies in a long, unwavering line that crested the ridge, a living fence between Rowan Hale and the rest of the world. Each man held a single, stark white feather. Its tip pointed toward the pale slit of morning. The only sound was the wind. It was a high, thin sound, pulling through the skeletons of shoya and rattling the dry seed pods of the yucca. It moved through the 70 riders, lifting the manes of their ponies and stirring the leather fringe on their shirts. That sound, and the weary, constant creak of 70 saddles, leather shifting on leather, wood shifting on bone. It sounded, to Rowan, like the desert itself was breathing, a slow, patient, indifferent breath. Rowan Hale stood alone on the canyon floor, his boots shuffling in the gravel. He was a man made of dust and mistakes, and right now, he felt every one of them. His hand, cracked and raw from the alkali flats, drifted instinctively to his right hip. His fingers found only the worn leather of an empty holster. He remembered. God, how could he forget the memory was only hours old, sharp and smelling of iron and sage. Last night, the moon had been a cruel sliver, offering just enough light to show him the color of the blood. He'd found her down in the arroyo, hidden by a wash of tamarisk, her body drawn tight against a pain he couldn't imagine. An Apache woman. She'd been shot, a bullet from a heavy rifle. Judging by the damage, a white man's bullet. She was dying. Not from the wound itself, it was high. Through the shoulder, but from the cold and the loss of blood. She was slipping into the shaking sleep that comes before the end. Rowan Hale, who had lost everything he'd ever built and was down to his last possession, looked at the woman and then at his horse. The horse was a rangy bay gelding, tough as boiled leather, with a deep chest and weary eyes that had seen 10 territories. It was his only horse, his legs, his transport, his last $5 in a world that measured a man by what he rode. A man on foot in the Arizona high country was just meat waiting for the buzzards. He had looked at her, and she had looked at him. Her eyes were black, bottomless with defiance and agony. He hadn't hesitated. Not really. He had torn a strip from his own bedroll to staunch the bleeding, his hands rough but surprisingly gentle. He'd lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He'd placed her in his saddle, draped his empty gun belt over the horn as a gesture he hoped she understood, and slapped the bay's flank. "Go," he'd whispered, his voice raw. "Hiya, get on, boy. Take her home." The horse, trained to his touch, had hesitated, looking back, but the woman, half-conscious, had slumped forward, her good hand grabbing the mane. The horse understood urgency. It had turned and picked its way up the arroyo, disappearing into the darkness toward the highlands, toward Apache territory, and Rowan had been left alone, with the smell of her blood on his shirt and the sudden, crushing weight of his own mortality. He had given away his life. Now, standing in the pre-dawn chill, that decision had come home to roost. He looked up from the empty holster. Below him, in the dry Needle Canyon, he could see the tracks, the fresh, sharp prints of his own horse, shod with the iron he had nailed on, were surrounded and swallowed by the dozens of prints from the unshod ponies. The trail of dust, still settling in the windless basin, led straight toward the riders on the ridge. They had followed the horse back to him. One warrior, sitting center in the line, moved. He was older than the others. His black hair shot through with broad streaks of silver, like frost on iron. He was Nantan Tajani. Though Rowan did not know his name, he only saw the authority in the man's stillness. Tajani raised his white feather. It was not a grand gesture, just a simple lift of the hand, in perfect, terrifying unison. The entire line of 70 warriors moved. They didn't surge forward. They didn't break formation. They simply shifted, flowing like water over the rock, splitting into two wings that began to descend the canyon walls on either side of him. It was the movement of a living chess game, precise and coordinated, each piece moving in support of the others, and all of them converging on the single, unprotected pawn in the center. They did not attack. They did not shout. There were no war cries, no howls to chill the blood. There was only the sound of hooves on stone and the sigh of the leather. They just came. They waited. The silence was the loudest thing Rowan had ever heard. It was an indictment. It was a verdict already rendered. His mind, starved of water and sleep, flashed back again. The woman, just before he'd slapped the horse, her eyes had fluttered open. She'd seen the falling star concho on his bridle, the one he'd hammered himself from a Mexican silver dollar in a lonely line shack 2 winters ago, a symbol of a wish he'd long since forgotten. Her lips had moved, forming a sound, a name. Dacina, she had whispered. The sound barely louder than the blood dripping onto the sand. Then she had fainted, slumping against the saddle horn. Dacina! Now! Surrounded. Rowan Hale raised his empty hands. The cold air stung his palms. He tried to lick his lips, but his tongue was a piece of dry wood. "I don't want any trouble," he called out. His voice cracked, sounding small and foolish against the vast rock walls. The woman, Dacina. I helped her. There was no answer. The sallow-faced warrior, Tajani, simply watched him from 20 yards away. The 2 wings of the formation had closed the loop. He was inside their circle. The Suan Nui, the canyon, the entire world, answered him only with the dry, skeletal rattle of the wind chimes he'd heard earlier. The desert wind whispering through the brittle, dead things. The symbol he had made, that falling star of hammered silver, was gone. It was gone with his horse, gone with his gun belt, gone with the woman named Dacina. He had signed a contract in the dark, and now, in the hard gray light of morning, the other signatories had arrived to discuss the terms. He had given his only horse to a wounded Apache woman, thinking it an act of simple humanity, an ending to his own story of failure. He was wrong. It was not an ending. It was the beginning. The central, terrifying question hung in the air, heavier than the cold. What unthinkable thing would 70 warriors, silent and patient, do with him, now that they had him, instead of simply against him? The sun, finally, broke the line of the ridge, and Rowan Hale was trapped in a circle of 70 feathers, 70 ponies, and one profound, unblinking silence. The circle of 70 riders did not break. It flowed. Nantan Tajani, the silver-haired warrior, gave no audible command, but his pony shifted, stepping back 3 paces. The warrior beside him mirrored the movement, and the one beside him, and the one beside him, until a gap opened in the wall of horses and men. It was a silent, fluid parting, like water moving around a stone. The gap they created was not an exit. It was an invitation. It revealed a path that Rowan had not seen, a narrow slice in the canyon wall that looked less like a trail and more like a fissure, a place where the mountain had cracked open. The entrance was a blade's edge of shadow, barely wide enough for a single horse. This was the way into Kestrel Basin, a place hidden from the maps of white men, a secret held tight by the rock. And from that shadow, 2 figures emerged. The first, Rowan recognized instantly, and his heart gave a painful lurch that was half relief, half terror. It was the woman, Dacina. She was alive. She was not on a horse, but standing on her own feet, though she favored one side. Her black hair was unbound, falling over the dark, dried blood that still stained her buckskin shirt. A thick, poultice-like bandage, dark with herbs and bound with yucca fiber, was wrapped tightly around her left shoulder and chest. Just as he remembered, she was pale, her face taut with pain, but her eyes were clear. They were the same black, defiant eyes he had seen in the arroyo. The second figure was a man, ancient and straight as a pine. He wore a shirt of dark, smoked leather, so old it seemed a part of his own skin. His face was a map of gullies and ridges, his white hair braided with strips of otter fur. This was Elder Kolo. His eyes held no malice, no anger, no curiosity. They held only a vast, settled weight, as if he had been waiting for Rowan Hale his entire life. Dacina walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on the elder's arm, more for balance than support. They stopped 10 feet from Rowan. The 70 warriors remained mounted, a silent, curved amphitheater of witnesses. Dacina's gaze met Rowan's. He saw the memory of the cold and the pain in them, but he also saw a strength that humbled him. When she spoke, her voice was low, and her English was slow, measured, each word chosen with care. "My grandfather," she said, nodding toward Kolo, "wishes to thank the man who returned the breath to his granddaughter." Rowan's whole body felt tight, strung up. He was a man used to simple transactions, $1 for a drink, a day's work for a day's pay. This was something else. He shook his head, the gesture small, almost spastic. "Ma'am, I didn't do anything worth this." He gestured to the 70 silent riders. "I just did what was right. Anyone would have done it." Dacina translated his words. Elder Kolo listened, his gaze fixed on Rowan's face, not on Dacina's. When she finished, the old man spoke. His voice was not the thin ree of an old man. It was deep, resonant, a sound that came from the earth itself. He spoke in the Apache tongue, a rhythmic cascade of sounds that Rowan could not parse but instinctively understood as powerful. It was not a speech of gratitude. It was a speech of definition. The words were heavy, like stones being placed one on top of the other, building a structure Rowan could not see. When he finished, a profound silence fell. Dacina looked at the ground for a moment, as if gathering the right words. "My grandfather says," she began, then paused. She looked back at Rowan, a deep furrow between her brows. "He says right is a white man's word for a debt that is finished. You find a dropped coin, you return it. The act is done. That is not what happened." She gestured to the warriors, to the white feathers they held. "These," she said, her voice dropping, "are not for you." Rowan flinched. "I don't understand. They are not a gift. They are a sign. They tell the rocks, the wind, the other bands, that the man who stands here is in between. He is not an enemy to be struck down. He is not a brother to be embraced. He is a man who stands on the boundary line. He is under our protection until the matter is settled." Settled. Rowan's voice was dry. "I gave the horse. The horse brought you home. It's settled." A flicker of something pity perhaps crossed Dacina's face. "No, here, the act is not finished. You did not give a horse. You gave your horse, the only one. You gave your legs, your safety, your future to save the life of one of our blood. This is the law of the horse gift." Kolo spoke again. A single, sharp sentence. Dacina translated. "When a man gives his life to save another, he places a rope of obligation, not on the one he saved, but on himself." Rowan stared, his mind reeling. This was insane. This was backward. I saved her. How does that put an obligation on me? "You tied the knot," Dacina said simply. "You started a story. Our law says you must be the one to see it through. You must be the one to tie it off. You have bound yourself to our fate until the story is complete." Nantan Tajani, the silver-haired warrior, urged his pony forward. He was the one who had led the party, the one who had first raised the feather. He stopped his mount directly in front of Rowan, close enough that Rowan could smell the horse sweat and the clean, sharp scent of juniper smoke on the man's leather shirt. Tajani said nothing. He simply held out his hand. In it, coiled, was Rowan's bridle. Rowan took it, his hand trembling slightly. The leather was familiar, worn smooth by his own grip. And there, on the cheek strap, was his concho, the falling star, hammered from a Mexican silver dollar, but it was changed. His simple, rough-hammered star was now framed by new marks, 4 thin lines of red ochre, painted with perfect precision, radiated from the star, marking the 4 directions. On the leather strap above it, a small, intricate design of a snake had been painted in the same red pigment. His work had been claimed, It had been written over. "It is done," Dasina said, her voice soft but firm. "Your horse is now a horse gift. The bridle is returned to you, so you know the horse is still yours. But it is marked. You are marked. You are written into the story of the people." Tajani's other hand came up. He held a single white feather, identical to the ones held by the 70 riders. He did not offer it. He held it out, waiting for Rowan to take it. Rowan looked at the feather. It was clean. Perfect. A wing feather from a white eagle. He understood, in a dim, primal way, that this was the most important object he would ever hold. To refuse it, he didn't know what would happen, but he knew it would be a disaster. To accept it, he accepted it. His rough fingers closed around the quill. It was light as air, but it felt heavier than his lost revolver. The moment his skin touched it, a sigh went through the 70 riders. It was not a sigh of relief. It was a sigh of acceptance. A thing was done. Tajani nodded once, a sharp, definite gesture. He backed his pony away, rejoining the line. Then, as one, the 70 warriors turned their horses. They did not turn to leave. They turned, half of them to the left, half to the right, to face the narrow, fissure-like path into Kestrel Basin. They were no longer a wall blocking him. They were an honor guard, lining the path. "They will not guard you as a prisoner," Dasina said. Seeing the look on his face, "They will escort you. The man who holds the horse gift feather is a man of great importance, until his story is tied." Elder Kolo turned and began to walk back into the shadow of the canyon, not once looking back, as if he knew Rowan would follow. Dasina held Rowan's gaze for one last, long moment. The gratitude was there, plain as day, a warmth in her black eyes. But it was tangled with something else, a warning, a deep, profound caution. "You must come," she said. "We will walk to Sable Rim, our village. You will be safe. You will be honored." Rowan took a single step forward, the feather clutched in his hand, and then what Dasina's face settled into a mask of solemnity, the brief warmth gone, replaced by the ancient law she served. "And then," she said, turning to follow her grandfather, "we will choose you at sunset." The walk to Sable Rim was a lesson in silence. Rowan Hale, the white feather clutched in his left hand, his returned bridle looped over his right shoulder, walked in the center of a moving universe. The 70 warriors did not crowd him. They did not prod him. They simply were. They moved around him in a loose, shifting formation. 2 wide wings of riders that flowed over the landscape like water parting around a boulder. 10 men rode ahead, scouts vanishing and reappearing on the high ridges, their movements signaled by the brief flash of a mirror or the subtle dip of a feather. 10 men rode behind, a rear guard that erased their trail, leaving the canyon as empty as they had found it. The rest, including Nantan Tajani, flanked him at a distance of 50 yards, their ponies picking through the rock and cholla with a silence that was unnatural. Rowan was a man on foot, his boots, already worn, complaining at every step. He was surrounded by 70 mounted men, any one of whom could have ended him with a thought. Yet he was not a prisoner. He realized with a cold jolt, a guest of honor, an object of some terrible, binding curiosity. He watched Dasina. She rode near the front, beside Elder Kolo. She sat a pony with a fluid grace, even with her bandaged shoulder. She did not look back. Not once. It took them 3 hours, climbing from the low canyons into a high, hidden basin, shielded by sheer walls of red sandstone. The village of Sable Rim was not a collection of teepees, as the broadsheets claimed. It was a permanent, rooted place. Wickiups, domed structures of willow and bear grass, were clustered in family groups under the shelter of a great stone overhang. The air, which had been sharp with alkali dust, was now soft with the scent of juniper smoke, roasting mezcal, and the smell of people, a human smell. He saw no fear as they entered. This was the source of the 70 warriors. This was their home. Children, naked and brown as river stones, stopped their games to watch him, their black eyes wide and serious, unblinking. Women, grinding corn on medet stones or weaving intricate baskets from willow strips. paused in their work. Their hands stilled, but their faces showed no alarm, only a deep, profound, and unsettling interest. They were looking at him as if he were a man who had already died and come back, or perhaps a man who was about to. They were not afraid. They were busy. There was a low, humming energy to the place, a focused industry. Women were separating strands of willow, their hands a blur. Young boys were carefully braiding lengths of green, pungent juniper wood, stacking them in neat piles. It was not the preparation for a war. It was the preparation for a ceremony. A sacred communal act was about to unfold, and he, Rowan Hale, was the centerpiece. They were led to the center of the village, to a wide, flat plaza of packed earth circled by smooth river stones. This was the Stone Ear Circle. Here, the escort of 70 warriors finally dismounted. They did not disperse. They formed a wide, standing circle, 3 deep, around the plaza. They held their white feathers, tips down, in a sign of respect. Elder Kolo moved to the center of the circle and knelt on the earth. Dacina stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. She was his voice, his bridge. Rowan was gently guided by Tajani to stand opposite them, about 10 feet away. The village watched. The wind died. The only sound was the crackle of a small, central fire that Kolo had lit. Kolo began. He moved with a deliberation that was hypnotic. He unrolled a small bundle of buckskin. From it, he placed 3 objects on the ground between himself and Rowan. First, a knife. It was not a weapon, not a skinning blade. The handle was the jawbone of a wolf, polished smooth by 1,000 grips. The blade was a piece of dark, flaked obsidian, sharp as glass. It was a tool for cutting things that were not flesh lies, bad medicine, broken promises. Second, a gourd, dried and hollowed, with a wooden stem. It was filled with sacred tobacco and herbs, a smoking gourd. Third, a shallow clay bowl filled with a dark, reddish-purple pigment, earth mixed with water from a sacred spring. Rowan's heart beat a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. This was a court, but not one he understood. Dacina stepped forward slightly. My grandfather will now begin. This is the choosing. It is not a trial for a crime. It is a weighing of a soul. It has 3 parts. She held up one finger. The first choosing the pure motive. We must know why you did what you did. A second finger. The second choosing the true cost. We must know what the act truly cost you. A third finger. The third choosing the spirit above the self. We must know if your heart is large enough to hold more than your own pain. A cold sweat broke on Rowan's neck. He looked at the 70 warriors. At the silent village. There was no escape. Before we speak, Dacina said, her voice softer now, you must be prepared. She held a long, plaited rope of soft, smoked leather. You must be bound. Rowan tensed, his shoulders nodding. I'm not going to fight you. We know this, she said patiently. This is not to stop your hands. It is to focus your words. A man who cannot strike with his fists must learn to strike with his truth. His words must stand in place of his muscle. He looked at her, then at Kolo. The old man was watching the fire, as if he were alone. Rowan slowly, reluctantly, held out his hands. Dacina stepped close. He could smell the herbs on her bandage, a sharp, clean scent under the wood smoke. She did not meet his eyes as she worked. She looped the leather cord around his right wrist, then his left, lashing them together in front of him, at his waist. Her fingers were quick, practiced. The rope was not tight enough to cut, but it was firm. It bound him. As she tied the final knot, the back of her hand, the knuckles warm and smooth, brushed for the briefest instant against the rough, chapped skin of his own. It was a feather-light touch, gone as soon as it registered. But it was the first kind contact, the first touch that was not medical or violent, that he had felt in he couldn't remember how long. His heart, which had been hammering with dread, gave a painful, awkward skip, like a stone stumbling in a dry creek bed. She stepped back, her face impassive. The moment was gone. Kolo looked up. The weighing had begun. An elder, not Kolo, but one of the 70 warriors with a face like a dried apple, spoke first. His voice was a harsh rasp. Dasina translated immediately. He asks, "Why did you not take the woman to the White Fort to Fort Ransom? You would be a hero to your people. They would give you money, a new horse, drink. Why give her back to us, your enemies?" Rowan felt the eyes of the village on him. He licked his lips. The lie was easy. I was scared. I didn't want trouble. But the obsidian knife lay on the ground, and he felt it could see the shape of a lie. He looked at Dasina, then at the elder. "She wasn't mine to take to any fort," Dasina translated. The elder's expression did not change. Rowan pushed on, the words clumsy. "She was hurt, but she belonged here. She belonged with her people. Taking her to the fort would have been a different kind of stealing. It wasn't my place." The words fell into the silence. Dasina's voice followed, turning his plain talk into the flowing Apache tongue. "When she finished," a low murmur went through the circle. Nods, small, definite nods. This answer, it seemed, was the right one. It was an answer of respect. The circle was silent again. Then, a new voice. It came from the side, from the women. An old woman, a matriarch wrapped in a deep blue blanket, stepped forward. Her hair was white as snow, and her eyes, though clouded with age, were sharper than the obsidian knife. She did not speak to Dasina. She spoke directly to Rowan, pointing a gnarled finger not at his face, but at his feet. She spoke, her voice surprisingly strong. Dasina translated, her own voice subdued. "Our grandmother asks, she sees your boots." Rowan glanced down. His boots were cracked, the leather split at the toe, the heels worn down to the nails. They were the boots of a man at the end of his rope. "She asks," Dasina continued, her eyes holding his, "Are you a man punishing himself for an old fault? Did you give the horse to lighten a burden on your own spirit, or did you give the horse simply to save a life?" This question was the real one. This was the knife. He could feel the shape of the lie again. "I just wanted to save her." It was clean. It was heroic. It was what they wanted to hear, and it was not the whole truth. He thought of Stone Willow. He thought of the fire. He thought of a small hand he had failed to hold. The failure was a cold, hard stone he had carried in his gut for 3 years. It was the stone that had driven him here, to this patch of godless rock, with one horse and an empty holster. He looked at the old woman. He had to give her the truth. All of it. "I don't know," he said, his voice raw. The admission tore at him. "When I saw her, I couldn't let another one die. Not like that." He swallowed, the truth bitter in his throat. "Saving her, it felt right. But I've been walking a long time, ma'am, trying to pay for a mistake. Maybe," he met the old woman's gaze. "Maybe it was both." The silence that followed was absolute. He had confessed. He had shown them the broken thing inside him. The old woman held his gaze for a long time. Then, she nodded slowly, a look of profound understanding on her face. She turned and spoke to Kolo. One short sentence. Kolo nodded. The entire village seemed to exhale at once. The ritual smoke, the tension, had thinned. His honesty, his refusal to paint himself a hero, had satisfied them. Dasina turned back to him, and for the first time, there was a small, hesitant light in her eyes. "The first choosing is complete," she said. "The grandmother has spoken for the people. You helped because your heart is human, not because your heart sought gain. The why is pure." Elder Kolo picked up the clay bowl of red earth. He dipped his thumb into the pigment and rose to his feet. He walked to Rowan and stood before him. He was shorter than Rowan, but he seemed to take up all the air. He chanted a low, soft song, and then placed his thumb on Rowan's forehead. He drew a single, heavy, wet line of red earth, from the hairline down to the bridge of his nose. It was not a violent mark. It was a claiming. It was a brand of acceptance. "This is the mark," Dasina said, her voice almost a whisper. "You have stepped onto the slope of the second choosing. You are, for now, one who speaks truth." Kolo stepped back, and Rowan stood, marked and bound, his heart skipping from Dasina's touch, his mind reeling from the judgment. He had passed the first test. He looked at the obsidian knife and the smoking gourd, and knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the next two would be harder. The sun, a heavy, molten coin, began to slide behind the sharp, black silhouette of sable rim. The light turned from gold to a deep, bruised crimson, casting shadows so long they seemed to pull the world apart. The air grew cold, sharp with the coming night. Rowan stood in the center of the stone-ear circle, the red earth on his forehead feeling tight as it dried. His hands were still bound before him. He had passed the first test, but the second and third, the true cost and the spirit above the self, had not yet been named. He braced himself for the next round of questions. The next psychic incision. He never came. Instead, a sound, a single, unified sound, cut the silence. It was the sound of 70 pairs of knees hitting the packed earth. As one, in a motion so coordinated it was like a single body moving. The 70 warriors of the escort dropped to one knee. The sound was a heavy, final thud, a punctuation mark on the day. They knelt, heads bowed, in the deep red dust. Rowan's breath hitched. His mind, steeped in the bloody tales of the border, leaped to a single, terrifying conclusion. This was it. This was the ritual. This was the preparation for the sacrifice. He was the offering, the white-skin payment for some unknown crime. His bound hands felt useless, his heart a trapped bird. Then, the procession began. Nantan Tajani, his silver-streaked hair catching the last red light, rose from his knee. He walked to Rowan, his eyes locked on the cowboys. He held the single white eagle feather in his hand. He stopped, not at a threatening distance, but close, at a distance of respect. He knelt again, this time at Rowan's feet, and placed the white feather on the ground before him, the tip pointing toward Rowan's cracked boots. Then, from his own belt, Tajani drew a knife. It was not a weapon of war, but a tool of great beauty. The handle was carved from a single piece of mountain sheep horn, translucent and worn smooth. The pommel set with a single, sky-blue piece of turquoise. He laid it gently beside the feather. He bowed his head, then rose and stepped back into the circle, kneeling once more. A second warrior came forward. He was younger, his face scarred from a fight Rowan couldn't imagine. He knelt. He placed his white feather. Then he laid down a small, tightly woven blanket, the pattern a series of black and red diamonds, a design of such complexity it must have taken a year to weave. He, too, stepped back. A third, an older man, his face a map of wrinkles. He placed his feather. He added a small, rawhide pouch, tightly bound, that smelled of sage and ochre, a medicine bundle, a thing of private, spiritual power. One by one, they came. The circle of kneeling men broke only for this single, solemn pilgrimage. Each warrior approached, knelt, placed his white feather, and then added a piece of himself to the growing pile at Rowan's feet, a bracelet of polished river stones, a length of rope, plaited from horsehair of 3 different colors, a carved piece of soapstone, formed into the shape of a hawk, a pair of finely beaded moccasins, small enough for a child. The pile grew. It was not a pile of tribute. It was a hoard of trust. It was a collection of identities, of personal treasures, of things that held spirits. Rowan stared, his terror melting into a profound, suffocating confusion. This was not a ritual of death. This was something else. This was an act he had no name for. When the last warrior had placed his gift, a single, perfect arrowhead of black obsidian, and returned to his place, Rowan was standing before a small mound of feathers and crafts, a museum of 70 lives. He looked at Dasina, his eyes asking the question his bound hands could not. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Nantan Tajani rose. He did not retrieve his knife. He stood, his hands empty at his sides, and faced Rowan. And for the first time, he spoke to him in English. His words were slow, thick with the accent of his own tongue, but they were clear. Each word was a stone dropped into a deep well. "We did not come to judge you. Rowan Hale," Tajani said, the use of his name a small shock. "We came to see if you could be judged. We came to see if your spirit was true." He gestured to the pile of feathers and knives and blankets. "These are not for a dead man. These are for a man who must be kept alive." Tajani stepped closer, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with ritual, and everything to do with a raw, human anger. "We came," Tajani said, his voice dropping, "to reclaim the justice that has been distorted by the blue hats, by the soldiers at Fort Ransom." A cold dread, different from before, settled on Rowan. Fort Ransom. He knew the name, a place of hard men and harder rules. "The woman you saved," Tajani continued, his gaze flicking to Dasina, who stood straight, her face a mask of pained dignity, "was not shot by accident. She was not shot by her own people. She was shot by a white man's rifle from a high ridge while she was gathering medicine by the water." The news landed like a fist. The bullet. He had known it was from a heavy rifle. "The water," Tajani said, his voice now vibrating with the core of the matter, "is the red comet wash. It is our spring. It is where we put the names on our children. It is where the women wash for their wedding day. It is our life, and it is being stolen." The story came out, piece by brutal piece. A man, a trader named Jebediah Pike, a man whose name Rowan had seen on dusty supply wagons, had found a way to make the desert bleed money. He had partnered with the new commander at the fort, a man with a hollow chest and greedy eyes, Captain Mercer. "Mercer and Pike," Tajani spat, "plot to take the water for themselves, to sell it to the new railroad, to the cattle barons moving in from the east. But the land is ours, by treaty and by spirit, so they must make it not ours." He explained the scheme. Pike's men, disguised, would raid their own supply lines, burn their own empty wagons, and leave Apache-marked arrows, bought in some border town. At the scene, they would foul the lower springs with chemicals, then ride to the fort and blame the Red Menace. Mercer, in turn, would declare the territory unsafe, declare the treaty broken by Apache aggression, and seize the land around the Red Comet Wash for the protection of the settlers. Then he would sign it over to Pike's new Waterland Company for a price. Dasina, Tajani said, saw them. She saw Pike's men planting the false signs by the water. The shot that struck her was meant to silence a witness. Rowan's mind reeled. This was not a frontier skirmish. It was a cold, calculated conspiracy. "But what does that have to do with me?" "You," Tajani said, "are the one thing they did not plan for." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. The entire village, the 70 kneeling warriors, waited. "This is the unthinkable thing. Rowan Hale," Tajani said, raising his hand and sweeping it across the kneeling warriors. "This is the choice. We, the 70 warriors of the Sable Rim, ask you, the white man who gave his horse to be our messenger, to be our witness. We ask you to ride to the gates of Fort Ransom, with us at your back, and demand a public parley. Demand that Pike and Mercer face our accusations in the light of day." Rowan's blood ran cold. "You want me to walk into a U.S. Army fort and accuse the captain of a crime, with 70 warriors at my back? That's not a parley. That's a declaration of war. They'll open fire before I say 10 words." "They will not," Tajani said, his certainty absolute. "How can you know that?" Tajani pointed to the pile of gifts at Rowan's feet. "Because of this is the oath. This is the third, choosing the spirit above the self. It is our spirit we place in you." He knelt and picked up the small, child-sized moccasins. He held them up. "Do you know whose these are? They belong to my son. He is 4 summers old, the man who laid them here." He nodded to the scarred warrior, gave the blanket his wife wove for their own bed. The old man gave the medicine that keeps his breath from failing. "These are not gifts. They are pledges." Tajani's voice became a vow. "If you agree to be our voice, we will place the honor of 70 families on your shoulders. From this moment, you are not a white man. You are not an in-between. You are the keeper of our future. and we will be your shield." He met Rowan's eyes. Mercer will not shoot, because he will know that if one bullet touches you, he is not starting a war with the 70 warriors. He is starting a blood feud with 70 families. He is touching the son of every man here. He is striking the wife of every man here. He is declaring war on our children. Even a fool like Mercer knows the cost of that. We will not be destroyed. We will become a fire that never, ever burns out. The burden of it, the sheer, crushing weight of 70 families, 70 lives, 70 futures, settled onto Rowan. He looked at his bound hands. He, a drifter, a failure, a man who couldn't even save his own sister. "I can't," he whispered, the truth tearing out of him. "You don't know who I am. I'm no one. I'm a ghost. You put your faith in me, I'll lead you into a trap. I'll get you all killed. I can't be this for you." The circle was silent. Rowan's confession of weakness, of fear, hung in the cold air. Elder Kolo, who had been kneeling in silence, rose. He walked to Rowan, his ancient eyes holding a deep, sad wisdom. He spoke, his Apache words soft but clear. "Dacina," her own voice trembling slightly. Translated. "My grandfather says the war was already lit by others. We do not ask you to bring the fire, we ask you to bring the light. He says a ghost is the one thing that can walk between two worlds. You are the man for this." Rowan looked from Kolo's ancient, patient face to Tajani's fierce, demanding one. He looked at Dacina, and he saw in her eyes not just the pain of her wound, but the burning need for justice. He looked at the pile of gifts, the tiny moccasins resting on the warrior's blanket. He thought of Stone Willow. He thought of the fire and the smoke and the feeling of utter, complete helplessness. He had run from that feeling for 3 years. Now, it was here again. But this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't being asked to save someone. He was being asked to speak for them, to stand for them, to be the light. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The red mark on his forehead was a brand. The gifts at his feet were an anchor. He straightened his shoulders. He looked Nantan Tajani in the eye. He nodded. "I'll do it," Rowan Hale said, his voice no longer a whisper. "I'll ride the horse I gave, but it has a new purpose now. We all do." The knots on Rowan's wrists were undone by the same old woman who had judged his spirit. Her hands were dry as corn husks, but surprisingly strong. He rubbed his wrists, the leather bindings having left deep red grooves in his skin. Nantan Tajani approached, leading Rowan's bay. The horse looked different. It had been fed well. Its coat brushed to a deep, ruddy sheen. His own worn-out saddle was cinched tight, but it was the bridle and the mane that held his gaze. The red ochre marks on the leather, framing his silver concho, seemed to pulse in the twilight. And tied into the horse's coarse black mane were dozens of small, white down feathers, soft as milkweed. They were not the strong eagle feathers of the warriors. They were the softer feathers of the nest, of the home. It was an honoring, and a reminder of what he now carried. He swung into the saddle. It was his horse, his leather, but it felt entirely new. He was no longer a man running away. He was a man riding towards something, with the weight of 70 families settled behind his ribs. Elder Kolo spoke, his voice quiet but carrying in the cold air. Dacina, who had been standing beside him, her face pale but set, moved toward a pony held by a young boy. "She is the witness," Tajani said to Rowan, who had started to protest. "Her word is the bullet. She must be there." Rowan watched her mount. She moved stiffly, her whole body rigid as she tried to avoid jarring her wounded shoulder. She settled into the pony's bareback pad, her left arm held tight against her body, her face beaded with a fine sweat of pain. But she did not make a sound. She gathered her reins in her good right hand and met his gaze. Her eyes were black, defiant, and ready. The command was a silent one. Tajani swung onto his own mount, and the 70 warriors moved. They did not form a column, nor a line. They flowed out of the stone ear circle, moving like a single, intelligent organism. They became, as Rowan watched, the 2 great wings of a hawk, 10 scouts, the Talons, had already vanished into the dusk, ranging far ahead. 10 men formed a rear guard, the tail, sweeping their trail and watching their backs. The other 50 split, forming 2 vast crescent-shaped wings that protected the center. And in that center, in the protected vital space of the hawk's body, rode Rowan and Asina. Beside them, silent, rode Kolo and Tajani. They rode through the high, cold desert, the land silvered by a 3/4 moon. The only sound was the muffled, rhythmic beat of over 70 horses moving through sand and gravel, a sound like a great heart beating. Rowan had never felt so exposed, and yet so profoundly safe. The warriors on his flanks were a living, breathing wall of duty. For hours, they rode in silence, each lost in the map of the journey ahead. The land was huge, empty, and indifferent. It was Dasina who finally spoke, her voice low, pulling Rowan from his thoughts. "The Red Comet Wash," she said, her voice just loud enough to carry over the sound of the hooves. "You know it by that name. The white men named it for the streak of red iron in the canyon wall." Rowan nodded, looking at her profile in the moonlight. "I've heard of it." "To us," she said, her gaze distant. "It is Ha'ibihi, the water of first breath. It is not just water. It is the first water. It is where we begin." She paused, and he let the silence stretch, knowing she was gathering her words and her strength. "When a child is born to the Sable Rim people," she continued, "it is held by the grandfather. Before the child takes its name, before it is known to the people, it is taken to the wash. The grandfather dips his finger in the water and touches the child's lips. He speaks the name into the water. So the wash will know the child, and the child will know its home." "My name," she whispered, "was spoken there." She shifted, wincing. When a woman is to be married, she goes there at dawn. She washes her face in the water, so she enters her new life with the blessing of the first breath. "The herbs I was gathering, the ones for my shoulder, they only grow in the mist by the spring. That is where I was, at Pajaro Gulch, just above the wash, when Pike's man shot me from the ridge." Rowan listened, and the crime of Mercer and Pike deepened. They weren't just stealing land. They weren't just stealing water. They were stealing a memory. They were stealing the place where names were born and lives were sanctified. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, filled with the weight of her story. Rowan found his own voice, tasting like dust. "I had a farm," he said, the words feeling strange. He hadn't spoken of it in years. "Back east, in the territories. Stone Willow, we called it. It wasn't much, just a patch of dirt by a creek that ran dry most summers." He swallowed, the memory rising up like bile. "I had a sister, Ilara. She was younger, full of fire. She was well. She was everything." He stared at his hands on the reins, his knuckles white. "There was a fire. A brush fire came up from the South Flatlands, pushed by a hot wind. It moved faster than a running horse. I told her to wait by the creek bed, where it was safe. I ran back to the barn for the horses. I thought I had time. I thought I could save it all." His voice went flat. "The smoke, it was like a black wall. By the time I got back to the creek, I couldn't find her. The smoke was too thick. I found her after, too late." He looked at Dasina. "That's why I'm here, why I was out on that ridge with one horse and no gun. I've been walking." He looked away, ashamed of the confession, but needing to give it. "When I found you in that arroyo, the blood on the rocks, it felt like the same fire. It felt like the same moment. I couldn't be too late again." Dasina watched him, her black eyes unreadable in the moonlight. She said nothing, but he felt, in her silence, a kind of understanding, a shared knowledge of what it meant to be marked by a single, terrible day. The sky began to change. The moon was swallowed by a bank of high, fast-moving clouds. The wind, which had been a low whisper, began to whine. A cold, sharp scent of ozone filled the air. Within minutes, the tail end of a high-country storm was upon them. It was not a gentle rain, It was a driving, freezing deluge that turned the sand to mud and the air to ice. Tajani gave a sharp, bird-like call. The formation tightened, the wings of the hawk folding in, sheltering the center. They left the open flatland and pushed into a maze of canyons, just as Rowan felt the cold seeping into his very bones. Tajani led them into a vast, natural shelter. It was Horseshoe Arch, a massive overhang of sandstone carved by a long-dead river, its opening 100 feet wide and 50 feet deep. It was a perfect refuge. The wind howled outside, but under the great stone roof, the air was still. The 70 warriors did not crowd the space. They dismounted, forming a silent, watchful perimeter around the two entrances, their backs to the fire, their eyes to the rain. They were sentinels, enduring the cold so that the center could be safe. A few of them, including Kolo, Tajani, Rowan, and Dasina, were given the deepest, driest part of the arch. A young warrior, using a fire drill and dry juniper tinder, had a small, bright fire going in minutes. It crackled, a spark of defiant warmth against the roar of the storm. Dasina sat close to the fire, her body racked with shivers. The drenching rain had soaked her bandage, and her face was pale, tight with a pain she refused to voice. "That bandage," Rowan said, his voice rough. "It's soaked. It needs to be changed, or the cold will get in." She looked at Kolo, who observed her for a moment and then gave a single, slow nod. Permission. Rowan knelt in front of her. "I have a strip of clean linen left in my saddlebag." He murmured, "It's dry." She turned her back to him, a gesture of trust that hit him harder than a fist. Her good hand went to the knot at her waist, fumbling with the wet fiber. "I cannot—" "Here," he said. His own hands were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from something else. He gently pushed her hand aside and worked the knot loose. He unwound the wet, herb-stained poultice. His fingers brushed the skin of her back, and she inhaled sharply, a sound that was half pain, half something else. He pulled the last of the bandage away. The firelight flickered on her skin, on the raw, angry wound at her shoulder. It was clean, but it was deep. Dasina had a small, dry pouch at her belt. "The herbs," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "They must be applied." He took the small packet of dried leaves and powder. He held the new, clean linen strip. "Tell me how." They worked together, their heads bent close over the task. The rain outside was a curtain, a steady, pounding drum that isolated them in their small circle of firelight. He held the herbs in his palm, and she, with her good hand, showed him how to mix them with a few drops of water from his canteen. He applied the new poultice, his touch as gentle as he could make it. "Now, the binding," he said. He had to wrap the linen strip around her, under her arm, across her back, and over her shoulder. To do it, he had to be close. His face was inches from her hair, which smelled of rain and sage. His arm had to circle her ribs. He threaded the bandage, his rough knuckles grazing her skin. She shivered, but not from the cold this time. He pulled the bandage snug, and his hand came to rest on her uninjured shoulder. He stopped. He wasn't tying the knot. He was just resting his hand there. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. He looked up, and she had turned her head. Her face was right there. They were knee to knee, face to face. The roar of the storm outside faded to a whisper. He could see the firelight reflected in her dark eyes. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his lips. His other hand, the one that had been bracing himself on the cave floor, lifted. It was trembling. He saw the dirt caked in his nails, the callus on his thumb. He hesitated, then slowly, so slowly she could have stopped him at any second. He raised it. He did not grab, he did not take. He simply let the backs of his fingers, chapped and rough, brush the smooth, cold skin of her cheek. It was a question. She did not pull away. Her eyes closed, and she leaned into his touch. A bare, fractional movement that was a profound answer. A small sigh, a release of pain and tension, escaped her. He leaned in. He kept his movement slow, respectful. This was not a taking. It was a finding. His lips met hers. It was not a collision, but a landing. Her lips were soft, warm from the fire. His were chapped and cold. It was a kiss of shared breath, of gratitude, of a loneliness so deep neither of them had known how to name it. It lasted only a moment, but it lit something inside him, a warmth that spread from his chest, like hot coals banked against the cold, a heat he thought had died 3 years ago at Stone Willow. His hand on her shoulder tightened, not in a grip, but in a shelter, a promise to protect. A sudden, violent gust of wind screamed through the arch, driving a sheet of rain sideways. It hit the fire, which sputtered and hissed, throwing a plume of sparks. A horse, startled, whinnied loudly from the darkness. The world rushed back in. They broke apart, as if surfacing from deep water. Rowan fumbled with the bandage, his hands suddenly clumsy, and tied the knot. His heart was hammering. "That should hold," he stammered, his voice thick. Dacina did not pull back completely. She looked at him, her eyes dark and wide in the renewed firelight. The storm, the mission, the 70 warriors, it was all still there. She leaned forward again, but this time, she bypassed his mouth. She rested her forehead against his, her wet hair cool against his skin. They stayed there, breathing the same air, their eyes closed. She spoke, so softly he barely heard her over the rain. It was not in English. It was in her own tongue, a short, melodic phrase. He did not understand a single word, but he understood the meaning. It was not a word of passion. It was a word of trust. It was the sound of a vow being given. "I don't know what that means," he whispered, his own forehead still pressed to hers. "It means," she whispered back, her breath warming his face, "that the spirit knows a true hand, even in the dark." They sat like that for a long time, while the storm raged, until the fire burned low and the first pale, watery light of dawn began to gray the edges of the sky. The storm had broken. The air was scoured, cold and painfully clean. Rowan rose, his body stiff, and went to check his horse. The bay nickered softly. The small, white down feathers tied into its mane were heavy with dew, clinging to the black hair like dozens of tiny, fading moons. The last remnants of the night, they mounted up in the cold, wet air. The 70 warriors reformed their silent, hawk-wing formation. They rode out of Horseshoe Arch and up the long slope of the final ridge. When they reached the crest, they stopped. The sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and gold. And there, in the basin below them, 5 miles distant, it stood, Fort Ransom. It was a scar on the land, a square of sharpened logs driven deep into the earth. The morning wind was already snapping the blue cavalry flag on its pole, the colors stark against the red rock. And even from this distance, Rowan could see the first light of morning catch on the tip of a sentry's bayonet, a cold, sharp glint of steel. The air in front of Fort Ransom was a different kind of cold. It was a dead, still cold, radiating off the high, sharpened log walls. The gate was a heavy, dark mouth of raw timber, barred from within. On the parapet, the silhouettes of blue-coated soldiers moved back and forth, small and dark against the bright, hostile morning. The blue flag snapped in the wind, a sharp, cracking sound, like a whip. The 70 warriors did not approach in a threatening mass. They flowed into the open ground before the gate, a space cleared for fields of fire, and formed a perfect, silent crescent, a half-moon of mounted men facing the fort, their ponies stamping and blowing steam in the cold. They were a living question, waiting for an answer. From the center of the line, a sound emerged. It was not a war cry. It was a high, clear, 2-note call, thin as a bird's cry. Nantan Tajani, his silver hair bright in the sun, lowered a small whistle carved from bone. It was the signal, the call for parley, the call for peace. Rowan Hale's heart was a dry stone in his chest. He looked at Dacina, who sat her pony beside him, her face a pale mask of determination. She nodded, just once. This was it. He nudged his bay gelding forward. The horse, adorned with the white down feathers of the nest, stepped out from the protection of the line. Rowan rode alone into the center of the killing ground, the 50 yards of open space between the 70 warriors and the fort's heavy gate. He could feel the eyes of the sentries on the wall, the sights of their rifles, prickling his skin. He stopped, a single rider, and raised his right hand. Clutched in it was the single white eagle feather. "Hello, the fort." His voice was rough, but it carried, "I am Rowan Hale. I am not a threat. I come as a messenger for the people of Sable Rim." There was a long, agonizing silence. The only sounds were the wind and the jingle of his own harness. "On the wall!" A soldier shouted something back, indistinct. A heavy bar groaned inside the gate. A smaller door set within the main gate, a Judas gate, swung open. 2 men stepped out, followed by a pair of armed guards who stood, rifles at the ready, just outside the door. The first man was tall, his blue uniform pressed to a razor's edge. His hat was low, his face narrow, and his beard was trimmed to a neat, severe point. A small brass CPP gleamed on his collar. This was Captain Mercer. He moved with a stiff, arrogant certainty. The second man was his shadow, but a poorly made one. He was dressed in dusty civilian clothes, a garish waistcoat straining over a round belly. His hat was pushed back, revealing a slick of oiled, thinning hair. This was Jebediah Pike, and his eyes, just as Rowan had imagined, were never still. They darted from Rowan to the 70 warriors, to the fort guards, to Mercer, then back to Rowan. They were the eyes of a corncrib rat, quick, greedy, and terrified of the light. "A messenger," Mercer called, his voice sharp and laced with contempt. He did not step any further from the gate. "We don't parley with murderers and thieves. That band you're riding with is responsible for 3 ambushes this month." "That's a lie," Rowan said, his voice level. He held the feather high. "And that's why I'm here. We are not asking for a parley with you, Captain. We are demanding a public hearing, in the open, right here, and we demand witnesses." Pike let out a nervous, wheezing laugh. "Witnesses? You have 70 of them, Cowboy. What more do you need?" "I mean civilian witnesses," Rowan said, raising his voice to carry. "We demand the presence of the people from Palo Verde Station, the blacksmith, the freighters, the storekeep. We will present our case before them, and before you." This was the move. Mercer could shoot 1 man and claim self-defense. He could refuse to parley with the Apache, but to refuse a public hearing in front of the very civilians he was sworn to protect. That was a different game. Mercer's eyes narrowed. He was trapped. The noise had already been heard at the station, a small collection of soddies and wooden storefronts just a quarter-mile down the canyon. People were already emerging, curious, shading their eyes. "This is irregular. Hale," Mercer snapped. "These are irregular times." "Captain," Rowan countered, "you want to prove to the civilians you're protecting them, then let them hear the truth, or are you afraid of what they'll hear?" Mercer's jaw tightened. He gave a curt nod to one of the guards, who jogged toward the station, clearly to summon the townsfolk. Mercer and Pike were forced to wait. The 70 warriors waited. Rowan waited, his horse standing like a stone, the white feathers in its mane ruffling in the breeze. Within 10 minutes, a small crowd of 20 or so civilians had gathered, standing in a nervous huddle between the fort and the Apache line. Rowan recognized the blacksmith, a huge man with soot-stained arms, and a few teamsters, and among them, a woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her arms crossed, her face set in a mask of permanent, skeptical disapproval. Maribel Voss, owner of the Palo Verde Saloon, and a woman who missed nothing. "Very well, Mr. Hale," Mercer said loudly. "Playing to the new audience? You have your circus. Now speak your piece, so I can send these hostiles packing." "They claim," Rowan said, "that their water, the Red Comet Wash, is being stolen. They claim they are being falsely accused of raids to justify it." Jebediah Pike stepped forward, his voice oily and false. "Stolen, that's rich, Captain. Folks that water ain't fit to drink, the Apaches have fouled it. It's that simple." He nodded to one of the guards. who brought out a canvas bucket of water and a strange contraption of glass jars and tin pipes. "My own invention," Pike said proudly. "A portable water filter? Had to design it myself just to make the water from that spring drinkable. They've been dumping things upstream, poisoning their own well, just to spite the settlers. We're not stealing it. We're saving it." He held up a jar of murky, brown water, taken from the wash not 3 days ago. Proof. Rowan looked at the water, then at Pike. "That's a clever story. Mr. Pike, but if the water's just been fouled, why were your men planting blasting caps at Pajaro Gulch?" Pike's rat eyes widened. "Just a fraction." "Blasting what I don't know what you're talking about. That's a wild accusation." "Is it?" Rowan pressed, his voice hardening. "Because the markings on the explosives, the ones found at the gulch, they match the shipping stencils on your freight manifests. The ones you filed right here at the fort. Why would a man trying to filter a spring need blasting powder? Mr. Pike." A low murmur went through the crowd of townsfolk. Mercer held up a hand. "These are serious, baseless charges. I have an official translator. Mr. Squires." A thin, weasel-faced man in a stained shirt stepped out from the fort. Mercer spoke to him in a low tone. Squires then shouted at the Apache line in a bastardized version of Spanish and Apache. Tajani replied, his voice a low, powerful rumble, his hand pointing to Dacina. Squires listened, then turned to the crowd. "He says the woman is lying. He says they want the water for their horses, and they want payment. 10 head of cattle." Rowan stared. It was a complete, intentional fabrication, designed to make the Apache look greedy and simple. Before Rowan could speak, Dacina urged her pony forward. She rode to stand beside Rowan, her left arm held stiffly, her face pale but burning with a cold fire. She spoke, and her voice, though strained with pain, was clear as a bell. It cut through the morning air, and it was in perfect, slow English. "He lies," she said, nodding at Squires, who shrunk back. "Nantan Tajani said that I am the witness to the crime, and that the water is not for horses. It is ha'ibihi, the water of first breath." She turned to the townsfolk, to Maribel Voss. "He calls it a spring. We call it the place where our names are given, where our children are blessed, where our marriages are sanctified. You." She pointed a trembling finger at Pike. "Did not just foul a spring? You have spat on our church, and the man who shot me from the ridge was one of his." The silence that followed was heavy, broken. The townsfolk looked at Dacina, at her wound, at her face, and they knew they were hearing a truth the translator had tried to smother. Mercer saw the tide turning. His face went dark with anger. He was losing control. "This is a farce!" he yelled. A premeditated demonstration. Sergeant of the guard fire a warning shot over their heads. "Disperse this rabble. Now." The sergeant on the wall raised his rifle. "No!" Rowan yelled. But the warriors did not draw their bows. They did not raise their rifles. In a single, breathtaking motion, 70 men swung off their horses. They landed on the ground, not in a charge, but in a genuflection. As one. They dropped to their right knee, and as one, each warrior reached to his belt, drew his white eagle feather, and placed it on the dusty ground before him. It was a sound Rowan would never forget, the sound of 70 feathers, 70 promises, being laid in the dirt, a sound of absolute, peaceful defiance. They knelt, unarmed, one knee on the ground, their heads bowed, in a posture of profound honor. "We come with honor." Tajani's voice boomed from the line. "We place our truth on the ground. We will not be moved by the sound of guns." Mercer was frozen, his order hanging in the air. The sergeant on the wall lowered his rifle, looking confused, to fire on kneeling, unarmed men even for him. It was a step too far. The crowd of civilians was mesmerized. They were no longer a nervous huddle. They were a jury. And then, from the back of the crowd, Maribel Voss stepped forward. She was holding a large, leather-bound ledger. "Captain Mercer," she said, her voice like grinding stones. "Mr. Pike, you've been running a tab at my saloon for months. provisions, drink, and other expenses. She walked right up to Pike, who backed away. She flipped open the book, her finger running down a page. "Here we are," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "An entry from Let's See 2 weeks ago. For services rendered transportation of cargo and blasting powder. And a note here, in your own hand. Mr. Pike, final delivery. Red Comet. You never paid for it." Pike's face, which had been pale, turned a slick, sickly gray. He was sputtering. "That's a freight charge, a misunderstanding I was hauling mining equipment for." "Was this man part of that mining trip?" Dacina's voice cut in, sharp as glass. She was pointing, not at Pike, not at Mercer, but at a young, terrified-looking private standing on the wall, the one who had hesitated with his rifle. All eyes Rowan's, Mercer's, Pike's, the town's. The 70 kneeling warriors snapped to the soldier. He was a boy, barely 20, his face covered in freckles and sweat. His name was Kerr. "Private Kerr," Mercer barked. "What is the meaning of this? Speak up, man." Kerr trembled, his rifle shaking in his hands. He looked down at the sea of faces, at the kneeling warriors, at Maribel Voss with her book, at Pike, who was glaring at him with a look of pure menace. Kerr stammered. "I was just following orders. Sir, I didn't know what it was, for a man paid me." "What man?" Rowan called up. "Who paid you, son?" "He paid me in gold." Kerr cried, the confession tearing out of him. "A $10 gold piece, just to bury the box. He said it was just some spoiled blasting caps. He said it was for a survey I didn't know." "Who? Private?" Maribel Voss's voice was relentless. "Who gave you the gold?" Kerr was weeping now, his terror absolute. He looked at Pike, his mouth opening and closing, but no name came out. He was too afraid of Mercer, but he didn't have to say the name. His eyes, full of terror and accusation, were locked on Jebediah Pike. The mask had fallen. Mercer's face was no longer angry. It was a cold, hard, flat thing. His hand, in a slow, deliberate motion, dropped to the flap of his holster. Pike, his oily confidence completely gone, was sweating through his waistcoat, his rat eyes darting left and right, looking for a shadow, any shadow, to run to. The trap, laid by 70 feathers and 1 ledger, had snapped shut. Captain Mercer's face was a mask of cold iron. The confession of Private Kerr had hung him, had hung them all. His hand didn't just rest on his holster, it unfastened the leather flap. He was a man trapped in a box of his own making, and his only way out was to burn the box. "Sergeant of the Guard." Mercer's voice was no longer a politician's. It was a bark. "To the walls, all riflemen. To the parapet. This is an unlawful and hostile assembly. I want a firing line. Now, prepare to repel." The command shattered the fragile courtroom. On the wall, soldiers, startled from their role as jury, scrambled for their rifles. The metallic clack-clack-clack of actions being worked, of cartridges being chambered, was terrifyingly loud in the sudden silence. Private Kerr whimpered, flattening himself against the logs. The townsfolk gasped, stumbling back. This was it, the massacre. Mercer was going to erase the witnesses. Rowan felt his blood run cold. He looked at the 70 kneeling warriors. They were exposed. They were the targets. But as the rifle barrels lined the top of the wall, Nantan Tajani gave a signal. It was not a call to arms. It was a simple, fluid lift of his hand. In a single, unified, and utterly baffling motion, the 70 warriors rose from their knees, but they did not reach for their weapons. They did not raise a shield. They turned their backs, as one. The entire crescent of men pivoted on their heels, until all 70 of them were facing away from the fort, away from the loaded rifles. They stood, their spines straight, presenting their backs as the ultimate target. Rowan stared, his mouth open. "What are they doing?" he breathed. It was suicide. And then he saw it. The morning sun, climbing higher, struck the buckskin and cloth of their shirts, and he saw what they had been hiding. Their backs were covered in handprints, small, perfect handprints, placed with care in reddish-brown mud and yellow ochre. the handprints of children. Some shirts had only one or two, high on the shoulder. Others were covered, a cascade of tiny palms and fingers, as if a group of children had gathered to push their father forward. It was a symbol, so profound and so brave it stopped Rowan's heart. It was a visual shout, louder than any war cry. This is what you are shooting. You are not shooting a warrior. You are shooting a father. You are firing into the back of a man who carries his children. The soldiers on the wall saw it. Their hands, which had been steady, now wavered. The blacksmith, the teamsters, they all saw it. Maribel Voss, who had been watching Mercer with an expression of pure contempt, snapped her ledger shut. The sound was like a gunshot. "Well," she said, her voice carrying, "I've seen enough. I'll be damned if I let a man like that speak for my station." And she began to walk. She walked out from the huddle of civilians, past Rowan, and into the open killing ground. She walked until she was about 20 yards from the kneeling warriors, and she stopped. She turned, crossed her arms, and faced the fort. Her back to the Apache. "She's shielding them," a young teamster whispered. The big blacksmith, his arms thick as fence posts, let out a shaky breath. "She's got the right of it. That ain't a fight. That's just murder." He walked out and stood beside her. Then another, and another, one by one, then in a small, stumbling rush. The 20 men and women of Palo Verde Station walked into the open. They formed a thin, ragged, civilian line, a living wall of conscience. They stood between the muzzles of the fort's rifles and the backs of the 70 warriors. Mercer's face was purple. "Get back," he screamed. "Civilians, that is a military order. Clear the field. You are interfering." No one moved. Rowan felt a firelight in his own chest, a feeling he hadn't known since Stone Willow. It was the feeling of rightness. He saw a hay wagon, parked near the gate, waiting for delivery. He scrambled up the side, pulling himself onto the dry, fragrant pile of hay until he was standing above the crowd, above the tension. "Mercer," he roared, his voice breaking with the strain. "Look. Take a good, long look at what you're aiming at." He pointed to the civilians. "These are your people, the ones you're sworn to protect. And they are standing in front of the men you're trying to murder. You fire that first shot, Captain, and it won't be hitting an enemy. It'll be hitting the back of Maribel Voss. It'll be hitting the back of the blacksmith who shoes your own horses." He swept his arm toward the warriors, their child-marked backs a silent, terrible indictment. "Whoever fires the first shot today is a coward. Whoever fires the first shot today will be shooting an innocent back, and God Almighty will not forget it." The silence that followed was absolute. The soldiers on the wall looked at each other. They looked at their captain, and they did not raise their rifles. From the line of warriors, a figure stepped forward. It was Elder Kolo. He walked with a slow, measured pace, his ancient spine straight. He passed between his own warriors. He passed through the line of civilian witnesses. He walked until he was standing alone in the dust, near the base of Rowan's hay wagon. He held the smoking gourd, the one from the ritual. He knelt, not in surrender, but in deliberation, and placed the gourd on the ground between himself and the fort. He rose, and he spoke in English, his voice deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "An outsider," Kolo said, his gaze finding Rowan on the wagon. "Gave his only horse to save our blood, and 70 homes, 70 families. Repay that honor. We come to place our truth in the light. This is our law." He then turned his ancient, unwavering eyes up to Mercer, who stood frozen on the wall. "This is our law. It is a law of life. What, Captain, is yours?" Mercer let out a sound. It was not a laugh. It was a dry, rasping bark of pure, cornered fury. "Law, you superstitious old. You talk to me about law, Sergeant. Aim for the leaders. Aim for the old one and the one on the wagon. Fire on my—" He stopped. His eyes, they weren't on Rowan. Or Kolo. Rowan followed his gaze. Mercer was looking past the riflemen, toward the corner of the fort, toward the heavy blockhouse, toward the dark, canvas-shrouded shape of the armory. He was looking at the Gatling gun. He wasn't thinking of a firing squad. He was thinking of annihilation. He was going to erase the entire scene, warrior and civilian alike. A hand grabbed Rowan's ankle, tight as a trap. It was Decina. She had moved to the wagon, her face slick with sweat, her eyes wide with a terrible, knowing urgency. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice a low, frantic hiss. He jumped down beside her, and she grabbed his wrist. Her grip was strong. He is not beaten. He is calculating. He is looking at the heavy gun. He is done with this talk. He will wait for night. And tonight the law of honor ends, and the law of war begins. My people will not be slaughtered. They will fight. This all will be for nothing but blood. We must have the whole truth. We must have it now. Rowan understood. The moral victory was not enough. He needed the final, legal link. He needed the confession. He nodded at Decina. He stepped away from her, away from Kolo, his boots heavy in the dust. He walked to the center of the yard, and he looked up at the wall. He found the weeping, trembling boy who had started it all. "Private Kerr." Rowan's voice was not a plea. It was a command. "You are a soldier of the United States Army. You swore an oath. You are not a murderer's pawn. You said a man paid you in gold. We all heard you. Look at these people. Look at their backs. You tell us the truth. Son, you tell us. Right now, who gave?" "You the gold." Private Kerr was broken. He looked at Mercer's murderous stare. He looked at Pike, who was shaking his head frantically, his mouth forming the word no, no. He looked down at Maribel Voss, and the blacksmith, and Kolo, standing in the dust. A great, shuddering sob tore out of the boy's chest. "I didn't know," he screamed, the words dissolving into tears. "I didn't know he was going to hurt anybody. He said it was just a survey. It was—" The boy's arm, his trembling, accusing arm, shot out. His finger, a pale, shaking spear of judgment, pointed directly at the sweating, collapsing form of Jebediah Pike. "It was him. He gave it to me. He gave me the $10 gold piece." Pike made a sound, a high, strangled squeal. He did not deny it. He did not argue. He was a rat, and the light was on him. His eyes darted to the side. A soldier's horse was tied to a hitching post near the main gate. He bolted. He shoved a teamster aside and ran, scrambling over the hard-packed earth, his only thought to get to the horse and run until this territory was a memory. He was fast. He reached the post. His hand grabbed the reins. Thwump! A sound like a heavy book hitting a table. An arrow, black-feathered and deadly, slammed into the wooden hitching post, its steel tip burying itself deep. Not one single inch from Pike's white-knuckled hand. Pike screamed, falling backward into the dust. He scrambled around, his eyes wide with animal terror, looking at the line of warriors. Not one of them had moved. 70 men still stood, their backs to him, their bows unstrung, their hands empty. The civilians had not moved. Rowan had not moved. The arrow, the single, perfect, and non-lethal warning, had come from the high rocks above the canyon, from a scout no one had ever seen. The message was absolute. You cannot run. The judgment is here. The arrow's thwump echoed. A final, wooden punctuation mark in the dust. Jebediah Pike lay flat on his back, his hands splayed, staring at the black-feathered shaft vibrating just inches from his fingers. He was panting, a high, thin wheezing sound, like a broken bellows. On the parapet, Captain Mercer was a statue of pure, distilled rage, his hand still on his useless revolver. The soldiers looked from their captain to the man on the ground, to the 70 warriors whose backs were still turned, and their discipline, their ironclad training, was cracking like thin ice. It was into this frozen, agonizing silence that Elder Kolo spoke. He did not shout. He uttered 2 sharp, clear words in the Apache tongue. They cut through the air. A command that was absolute. And the second, truly unthinkable thing happened. The 70 warriors, who had been standing with their backs to the fort, turned. They turned, not to face the soldiers, but to face each other. In perfect unison, they reached for their weapons. Rowan's heart stopped. He thought this was the signal for the attack. He was wrong. They unslung their rifles. They unstrapped the bow cases from their backs. They pulled the long, heavy knives from the sheaths at their hips. And they began to walk. They walked forward, away from their horses, away from the safety of their line, into the very center of the open ground. They walked past the line of civilians, past Rowan, past Kolo, until they stood in a tight, vulnerable huddle, equidistant from every loaded gun on the wall. And they laid their weapons on the ground. It was not a surrender. It was a statement. Rifles were placed gently, muzzles pointing to the earth. Bows were unstrung and laid beside them. Knives and hatchets were added to the pile, not thrown, but placed, with a deliberation that was almost sacred. In less than a minute, a small mountain of deadly potential lay gleaming in the sun, utterly abandoned. They stood for a moment, looking at the pile of their own power. Then, as one, they turned. They turned to face Rowan Hale. He was still standing on the packed earth, his heart hammering so hard it hurt his ribs. 70 men, warriors, fathers, husbands. They stood, their hands now completely, totally empty. They stood in the most exposed piece of land in the entire territory, their weapons 20 feet away, their backs to a wall of loaded rifles, and they faced him. Then, together, they raised their empty, open hands, palms up, holding them out to him. They were not begging. They were not surrendering. They were giving. They were giving him the one thing they had left, the one thing Mercer could not take and Pike could not buy. They were giving him their moral authority. They were handing him the reins of their destiny. A sound began. It was a low rumble, the sound of 70 male voices speaking in their own language, in perfect, solemn unison. It was not a chant, but a declaration, a single powerful sentence that vibrated in the air, that Rowan felt in the soles of his boots. He looked at Dacina, his eyes wide, uncomprehending. She had moved to his side, her face streaked with sweat and dust, her eyes bright with a pain that was not just from her shoulder, but from the sheer, terrible beauty of the moment. She translated, her voice trembling, but clear as a bell. "They say," she whispered, her voice thick, "the honor of our children is your armor." Rowan Hale staggered, as if he'd been struck. The honor of their children. It was not a shield of steel. It was a shield of consequence, of a future, of a trust so absolute it was terrifying. He looked at the empty, outstretched hands. He looked at the pile of weapons. He looked at the child prints on their backs. He was a drifter, a man who had failed his own blood, and they had just made him the guardian of 70 families. He was speechless. He was broken and remade in that single, silent instant. Nantan Tajani stepped forward from the line of warriors. His hands were as empty as the others, but he walked to his own pony, and from the saddle horn, he untied a single, long rein. It was not a working piece of leather. It was a ceremonial object, plaited with exquisite skill from the white hair of a spirit horse's tail. It was bright, pure, and strong. He walked to Rowan and held it out. "This," Tajani said, his English slow and heavy, "is for Biandi Daj, the one who leads through the storm. You have brought the light. Now, you must guide the thunder." Rowan's hand, calloused and shaking, reached out. He did not take the reins so much as it was given to him. The horsehair was cool and smooth. As his fingers closed around it, the 70 warriors lowered their hands. It was done. The command had been passed. Rowan stood, the white rein clutched in his fist. He felt the weight of it, the weight of 70 lives, 70 futures. He turned, no longer a ghost, no longer a drifter. He was the anchor. He looked at Mercer, whose face was a canvas of disbelief and fury. He looked at Pike, who was now crawling backward in the dust like a crab. And Rowan Hale gave his first command. "No one is to be shot," he said, his voice hard, carrying across the yard. "No one is to be chased. We are not here for blood." He turned and pointed, not at Pike, but at a long, low-slung building just inside the fort's open gate, Pike's warehouse. "We are here for the truth. Open it. Open, mister. Pike's supply house. Open it now, in front of the soldiers and the people of Palo Verde." Mercer's face went white. "You have no authority. That is private property." "This is a military—" Sergeant Rowan yelled, looking past Mercer to an older, barrel-chested soldier on the wall. A man with gray sideburns and a face like worn leather. "Sergeant, a crime has been confessed in your presence. The good name of the U.S. Army is being dragged through the mud by this traitor. Are you going to protect the truth, or are you going to protect him?" The older Sergeant Hollis hesitated for only a second. He looked at Mercer's spitting rage, then at the pile of abandoned Apache weapons, then at the line of his own neighbors standing as witnesses. He made his choice. "Private Kerr, you and 4 men on that warehouse. The blacksmith will assist," he barked. The big blacksmith grinned and tossed his hammer in the air, catching it. "My pleasure, Sergeant." A group of soldiers, moving with a new, grim purpose, hustled a sputtering pike toward the warehouse. The blacksmith shattered the heavy padlock with a single, contemptuous blow. The heavy wooden doors groaned open, revealing a dark, cool interior that smelled of burlap, grease, and chemicals. "Bring it into the light," Maribel Voss commanded, and the soldiers, obeying her now as much as their own sergeant, began hauling crates out into the sun. The evidence was damning. The first crate, when pried open by the blacksmith's bar, was not filled with mining supplies. It was filled with blasting caps, dozens of them, packed in sawdust. "The same as the one found at Pajaro Gulch," Dacina cried. The next crate held maps of the Red Comet Wash, with lines drawn and quadrants marked, titled Pikewater Land Company, Phase 1. And then, the final crate. It wasn't supplies, it was paperwork. And on top, a single, folded contract. Rowan snatched it up. It was an agreement between Jebediah Pike and Captain Silas Mercer for the exclusive leasing and management of all water rights within the Red Comet territory contingent on the UHS, Army's pacification and removal of hostile elements. And there, at the bottom, was Mercer's signature, a bold, arrogant scrawl, beside Pike's cramped, nervous one. "He signed it." Rowan breathed. "He signed it all." "Look!" the blacksmith roared, holding up a heavy burlap sack. "It's a wax stamper for his company." He showed the crowd. And tied to the bag of stamps was a burlap square, and pressed into the wax on it, clear as day, was the seal of the Pikewater Land Company. It was the evidence Pike had been planting all along. The crowd surged forward, a low, angry growl rising from their throats. Mercer, on the wall, saw it. He saw the contract in Rowan's hand. He saw the faces of his own men, now looking at him with undisguised contempt. He was finished. His career, his life, it was all over. He was a cornered snake, and he lunged. "You will not take me," he screamed. He ripped his revolver from its holster. He wasn't aiming at Rowan. He wasn't aiming at the warriors. He was aiming at the contract, at the evidence, at Maribel Voss, who stood closest to it, her face a mask of triumph. He leveled the gun. "No!" Rowan yelled. He was too far away. But Maribel Voss was not. She had been standing near the small fire the guards had used for their morning coffee. Her hand, in a motion faster than Mercer's, shot out. She didn't have a gun. She had a full, steaming kettle of boiled water, with a grimace of pure, righteous fury. She threw it. The kettle spun end over end, a black comet, trailing an arc of steam. It crashed into Mercer's chest, but the water, the boiling, scalding water, splashed up, dousing his face, his neck, and his gun hand. Mercer screamed. It was not a yell of anger. It was a high, thin, agonizing shriek. The revolver flew from his spasming, burned hand. It clattered onto the packed earth of the parade ground inside the fort. He collapsed, clawing at his face, his uniform smoking. On the wall, the line of soldiers, who had been frozen in horror, broke. Sergeant Hollis, his face grim, drew his own sidearm and pointed it, not at the crowd, but at his own fallen captain. "Stand down." Hollis roared, his voice cracking like a bullwhip over the chaos. "All men, ground your arms. This engagement is over." The captain is relieved of duty." The soldiers looked at each other, then at the sergeant, then at the weeping, scalded man on the ground. With a collective sigh of relief, they lowered their rifles. The siege was broken. The war was over before it began, down in the yard. Jebediah Pike, his last hope, his armed protector, now a shrieking, ruined man, simply collapsed. He fell to his knees in the dust, his fine waistcoat covered in filth. He looked up at Rowan, his face a mask of pathetic, sniveling terror. "Please," he wept, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "Please, mister, don't let him hurt me. It was just business, I was just trading. A man's gotta make a living, ain't he? It was just trade." The word died in his throat. The crowd, the soldiers, the warriors, all looked at him with a silence more damning than any curse. All eyes turned. They looked to the old man, Kolo. He had not moved. He stood, a pillar of quiet dignity, his hands clasped before him. The white man's law had failed, spectacularly. The white man's greed was laid bare. Now, what was the Apache law? What was the justice of the people? Kolo slowly raised his head. He looked past Pike, past the soldiers, past Maribel. His ancient eyes found Rowan Hale, who still stood, stunned, the white rein in his hand. The elder spoke, and his voice was not triumphant. It was heavy. "Outsider," Kolo said, his English clear. "You carry the honor of our children. You are the one who leads through the storm. Speak, now. What is the punishment? What is justice?" Rowan felt the weight of 140 eyes on him. He looked at the weeping Pike. He looked at the soldiers helping the screaming Mercer. He looked at the pile of Apache weapons, still untouched. He looked at Dacina, who watched him. Her breath held. He had the power of 70 families. He could have demanded blood. He could have demanded Pike's life, Mercer's life. But he thought of the child-sized moccasins. He thought of the words, "our church." He thought of the white rein, a tool to guide, not to whip. He took a deep breath. "Justice," Rowan said, his voice ringing with a new, hard-won authority, "is not one man's decision, and it is not vengeance." He pointed to Pike, and then to where Mercer was being held. "These two will be bound. They will be taken to Palo Verde Station. The civilians will hold them. They will stand for a civil trial in front of a circuit judge, using their own laws. The contract, the blasting caps, and the testimony of Private Kerr will be the evidence." He then turned and looked toward the high, distant canyon that held the Red Comet Wash. And the Wash Haibiihi. It does not belong to any company. It does not belong to any fort. It belongs to the people who were born from it. The treaty will be honored. The water is theirs. That is justice. The day had been stripped down to ash, and the night that followed was thick with the scent of it. But here, inside the small, warm dome of a wickiup, the air was different. It smelled of smoked hides, dried herbs, and a faint, musky sweetness that Rowan couldn't place. It was the scent of a home. He sat on a bed of soft furs, stripped to the waist, while the low fire painted flickering, rust-colored light on the curved willow walls. The chaos at the fort felt 1,000 miles away, a bad dream from another man's life. Pike and Mercer were in the custody of Sergeant Hollis, held in the Palo Verde saloon storeroom, awaiting the circuit judge. The 70 warriors had returned, not in triumph, but in a deep, weary quiet. Dacina knelt before him. The ordeal had drawn dark, bruised circles under her eyes, but her hands were steady. She was tending to a long, raw scrape along his right shoulder and collarbone, a gift from the scuffle when Mercer's gun had been drawn. He'd barely felt it then. He felt it now. She dipped a cloth into a shallow bowl of warm, herb-infused water. "You were careless," she murmured. Her voice was low, intimate in the small space. "He was desperate," Rowan countered, his own voice rough. He winced as she pressed the warm, clean cloth to the wound. Her touch was medicinal, precise, and yet it sent a tremor through him that had nothing to do with pain. "Desperate men are just animals with names," she said, her focus entirely on her work. She cleaned the scrape, her fingers gentle but firm, brushing away the dried blood and dust. The heat from her body, from her proximity, was a living thing. When she finished cleaning the wound, she did not immediately reach for a bandage. Her hands simply stilled. She knelt, her face just inches from his. Her work was done, but neither of them moved. The silence in the wickiup was a tangible thing, a blanket settling over them. Outside, the sounds of the village were muted, distant. He could see the firelight reflected in the dark, wide pools of her eyes. He could feel her breath, warm and tasting of juniper smoke, on his skin. He had faced down 70 warriors and a U.S. captain. But the quiet courage it took to not look away from her gaze was almost more than he possessed. She spoke, a whisper, in her own tongue. The words were soft, a rhythmic cascade he could not understand. It was not a question or a statement, but a releasing, a prayer of thanks. Perhaps a litany of the day's terror, now past. "I don't—" he started, his voice a dry croak. "Shh," she breathed. Her right hand, the one that had held the cloth, lifted. It was warm and damp. She did not touch his wound. She placed her palm flat against his chest, on the uninjured side. He felt the light, calloused texture of her skin, and beneath it, the frantic, heavy beat of his own heart, a beat that seemed to answer the rhythm of her whispered words. He stopped breathing. She leaned in, slowly, her eyes never leaving his. He saw the question in them, the same one he had felt at Horseshoe Arch. But this was different. That was a moment of shared shelter in a storm. This was a choice, in the quiet, in the safety of her home. She kissed his forehead. The touch was soft as a moth's wing, a blessing against the red paint that was still smudged there. It was a kiss of peace, of absolving the day's fear. Her hand moved from his chest, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, a touch that was both curious and infinitely tender. She kissed his cheek, just beside the corner of his eye. It was a kiss of familiarity, of acceptance. And then, her breath mingling with his, she kissed his lips. It was slow. It was a discovery. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, aching relief. It held the rain of the night before, the smoke of the morning's confrontation, the weight of the 70 child-marked backs. It was a kiss that said, "We are alive. We are here." Rowan's own hands, which had been resting, useless and shaking, on his knees, finally moved. One hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her long, unbound hair, which felt like cool silk. His other hand, the one on his wounded side, moved to her back, pressing against the strong, straight line of her spine. He drew her closer, a motion of pure, protective instinct. He felt the slight, solid weight of her against his chest. He held her, but he did not crush her. It was an embrace of equals, a shelter he was both giving and receiving. He could feel her heart now, a rapid beat against his ribs, fluttering like a captured bird, and it seemed to be finding the same rhythm as his own. The world, which had been a map of sharp edges and sudden drops, softened. It shrank to the circumference of this wickiup, to the small, warm circle of this fire. He broke the kiss, but only to rest his forehead against hers, just as she had done in the cave. He breathed in the scent of her, sage and smoke and the clean, female smell of her skin. "Dacina," he whispered. He said her name not as a word, but as a prayer, as an anchor. It was the only word he knew that made any sense. A sound rumbled in her chest, and it took him a moment to recognize it. She was laughing, a low, soft, breathy laugh that was the warmest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of attention that had been held for days, for weeks, for a lifetime, finally letting go. She pulled back, just enough to look at him. Her eyes were bright, the firelight dancing in their depths. She reached for something around her own neck. It was a simple string of dark, polished beads. He saw now they were not beads, but tiny, hollow bones, polished, smooth as river stones. The bones of a small bird. She held it up. My grandmother gave this to me, she said, her voice soft. From the first hawk she ever tamed. It is for seeing clearly, even when the sky is dark. She leaned forward and, with a gesture of profound solemnity, slipped the string of beads over his head. It settled against his skin, surprisingly cool. It is not, she said, her fingers touching the beads where they lay on his chest. To own, it is to remind. To remind me of what, he asked, his voice thick. That even a man who thinks he has nothing, she said, can hold the sky in his hand, and that he does not hold it alone. He touched the beads, their lightness a strange contrast to the weight of the white rain he had been given. They settled. The exhaustion of the day, of the last 3 years, finally caught up with him. He lay back on the soft furs, and she lay beside him. Not touching, but close. They lay on their backs, staring up at the smoke hole, at the few stars that glittered in the small, dark patch of sky. A new sound drifted into the wickiup. It was thin and high and haunting. The sound of a flute. Then another joined it, and another, in a melody that was not a melody, but a series of scattered, breathy notes. Rowan turned his head. What is that? Dasina smiled in the dimness. 70, she said. There is a flute for each warrior who rode with you, a song for each family that put their honor in your hands. They are not sleeping, they are watching, they are guarding this WV, they are breathing with us. He was not alone. The realization was so vast it almost hurt. He was wrapped in a blanket of sound, of 70 watchful souls. The safety, the intimacy, the flute song. It all unlocked the final, deepest door inside him. He had told her of Stone Willow, of Ilara, but he had not told her the secret at the core of it. I didn't just fail to save her, he said, his voice a raw whisper, the words tearing their way out. The fire, it was coming from the south. The creek was to the north. Safety. I told her to wait there, but the barn, with the horses, with everything we owned, it was east. I ran for the horses. He closed his eyes, the memory vivid and burning. I chose things over her. I thought I had time. By the time I realized the wind had shifted, by the time I ran back, the smoke was... I was too late. I didn't lose her. Dasina, I traded her. The confession hung in the smoky air, ugly and sharp. He felt the shame of it wash over him, cold and complete. He waited for her to say something, to condemn him, to pity him. She did neither. She was silent for a long time. Then, she moved. She rolled onto her side to face him. He felt the light pressure of her hand on his chest, her palm settling directly over his heart, her fingers splayed over his ribs, over the bird-bone beads. Here, she whispered, her voice a fierce, low rumble. You breathed with one heart, and it was broken. It carried too much. Her fingers pressed, a gentle, insistent warmth. Now 70 hearts help you breathe. They will help you carry this. You are not one man anymore. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 years. He opened his eyes. She was watching him, her gaze clear and strong. The fire, which had burned low, suddenly popped. A piece of dry juniper exploded in a shower of bright, harmless sparks. It was so loud in the quiet Keop that they both startled. A small, electric jump, and then they laughed. It was not her soft laugh from before. It was a real, shared, barking laugh, a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief, a laugh of survivors. It bubbled up out of Rowan, a sound he didn't recognize, and it mixed with hers, filling the small dome with a life that had nothing to do with fear or honor, and everything to do with simple, shared joy. As their laughter faded, a new sound began, a soft, rhythmic patter on the hide roof. Rain. A gentle night rain had begun to fall. Good, Dasina murmured, lying back again. It is washing the dust from the air, washing the ash of the fight from the wickiup. A cleansing. The flap of the Keop lifted, a dark slice in the firelight. Both of them tensed. It was Elder Kolo. He did not enter. He stood in the opening, a silhouette against the rainy dark. His gaze was kind. He looked at Rowan, then at Dacina, then at the healing bowl between them. He nodded once, a gesture of profound, fatherly approval. He bent and placed 2 items just inside the wickiop, on the dry earth. A small, sealed clay pot and a single, new, perfect white eagle feather. "For the scrape," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The ointment will stop the sting." He touched the feather. "For tomorrow, we complete the ritual, we tie the knot." He nodded again, and was gone, the flap falling closed, leaving them once more in the warm, private dark. Rowan lay back, his body aching, his heart full. He touched the cool clay pot, then the soft, strong quill of the feather. He looked at Dacina, her eyes closing, her breath evening out, her hand still resting lightly on his chest. He finally understood. He had been looking for a single, cinematic moment of redemption, a single act of fate that would wash him clean or destroy him. But this love, this belonging, it wasn't a thunderclap. It wasn't a thing that fell on you. It was a choice he had made when he gave his horse, a choice the 70 warriors had made when they knelt, a choice he was making right now, lying in the dark, listening to her breathe. It was a choice you had to make, over and over, every single day, in the face of all the danger the world could throw at you. He closed his eyes, the sound of the flutes and the rain weaving together, the weight of her hand a steady, living anchor. He awoke to a single, sharp beam of light. The rain had stopped. The morning sun was piercing the smoke hole at the apex of the wickiup. The beam cut through the dim, smoky air, and in it, thousands of tiny dust motes, stirred by their breath, danced and floated. They looked like tiny, slow-moving stars, like a galaxy captured in a jar. He turned his head. Dacina was already awake, lying on her side, watching him. A small, slow smile touched her lips. "The new day," she said, her voice soft, "always asks. We answer with truth." The reckoning came not with a gunshot, but with the scraping of a wooden bench on a dirt floor. The courtroom was the open-air space in front of the Palo Verde Station saloon. The 20 civilians, led by Maribel Voss and the blacksmith, had formed a local jury. Sergeant Hollis, his face like carved granite, stood for the U.S. Army, his men standing guard, their rifles held in a parade rest that was anything but ceremonial, and forming a great, silent shawl around the entire proceeding, standing in a wide crescent that began at the saloon and ended at the livery, were the 70 warriors of Sable Rim. They were on foot, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. They did not interfere. They simply watched. Their presence was the conscience of the court. The evidence was laid on 2 trestle tables. Maribel's ledger, open to the damning page, the crate of blasting caps, the wax seal, its burlap square sitting beside it like a confession, and the contract, weighted down by a stone. Mercer's and Pike's signatures stark in the morning light. Private Kerr, his face pale but his voice steady, gave his testimony about the $10 gold piece. The jury of townsfolk didn't even need to deliberate. The blacksmith, wiping his hands on his apron, stood as foreman. "We find," he said, his voice a low rumble, "that Mr. Pike is a thief, a liar, and has endangered this entire community by attempting to incite a war for his own profit. His goods," he nodded to the warehouse, "are forfeit to pay his debt and to pay for the feed and supplies he took on credit from Mrs. Voss." Pike, his hands bound, simply wept. "And as for Captain Mercer," the blacksmith continued, his eyes hard as iron, "he has broken his oath. He is not fit to wear the uniform. We, the people of this station, ask that Sergeant Hollis take command of the fort, and that Mercer be held for the territorial judge on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." Sergeant Hollis nodded once. He stepped forward, and in a single, humiliating motion, ripped the captain's insignia from Mercer's collar. Mercer, his face still blistered and red from the scalding, said nothing. He had been broken. The white man's justice was done. Now, the people's justice. All eyes turned to Elder Colo. He had stood apart, listening. He did not look at the bound men. He looked at Rowan and at the civilians. "We did not come for blood," Kolo said, his voice quiet but carrying. "We did not come for Pike's goods. We did not come for the captain's rank." He paused, and his gaze swept to the high red cliffs, in the direction of his home. "We came for the water. We came for Haibihi." He did not demand. He stated a fact. Maribel Voss stepped forward. "The wash is on land marked by the treaty. It is theirs." "A treaty is paper," Kolo said, his voice sad. "Paper burns. Paper is forgotten. We need a covenant of the skin, of the earth." And so it was decided. The entire assembly, warriors, soldiers, and civilians moved. It was a mass pilgrimage, a 2-mile walk from the station to the mouth of the Red Comet Wash. It was a place of astonishing beauty. The water, clear and cold, bubbled up from a deep, hidden spring, running over a bed of bright red rock, the comet that gave it its name. It was shaded by ancient cottonwoods, a slash of impossible green in the dry, red world. Kolo stood at the water's edge. He did not demand that the white settlers be barred. He offered something else. "A shared covenant," Rowan said, translating the elder's quiet words. "The water belongs to the people. It is their church, but the earth is for all. Any man, woman, or child of any people who is dying of thirst may come and drink. Any family in a time of great drought may ask for water for their stock." He looked at Maribel and the blacksmith. "But they must ask. They must honor it as a gift, not take it as a right. And any company, any man who tries to sell this water, who tries to foul it or dam it or build a machine on it, he will not face one people. He will face both of us. He will face the soldiers of the fort, the rifles of the station, and the arrows of the 70 families." The covenant was agreed. Then, Kolo gave the signal. The sealing of the oath began. Nantan Tajani, his face a mask of solemnity, walked to the water's edge. He held the white eagle feather he had carried, the one that had marked Rowan as in between. He knelt, spoke a single word, and pressed the quill deep into the wet, red mud of the bank. The white feather stood, stark and bright, against the water. Then the next warrior, and the next, one by one, in a silent, powerful procession. The 70 warriors of the escort walked to the bank. Each man knelt. Each man planted his white feather. It was the promise. It was the oath. Fulfilled. It was the boundary line, no longer of suspicion, but of shared protection. When they were finished, a line of 70 white feathers guarded the spring, their tips like white fire in the morning sun. The ritual was almost complete. Rowan watched, his heart full. He had been the messenger. His job was done. But Kolo turned to him. "Now," the elder said, "the knot must be tied." Rowan was confused. "The knot is tied. The water is safe. Not this knot," Kolo said, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "Yours." He motioned for Rowan to kneel. Rowan, his heart suddenly hammering, knelt in the red mud. Facing the elder, he felt a presence at his side. Tasina. She stepped up beside him and, in front of the warriors, the soldiers, and the townsfolk, she placed her right hand firmly on his shoulder. A public, unshakable declaration. Kolo held a small bowl. In it was not just the red earth of the warrior, but a paste of blue minerals, mixed with the sacred water of the spring itself. "The first choosing," Kolo said. "We marked you with the earth, as a man of truth." He dipped his thumb in the new, blue-red paste. "Now, we mark you with the water, and the sky." He pressed his thumb to Rowan's forehead, where the first red line had been, but he did not draw a line. He drew a spiral, a swirl, the symbol of the living, moving water, the mark of Haibihi. "We do not make you one of our people. Rowan hail," Kolo said, his voice deep and warm. "We do not turn a white man red. We see the one of us that was already in you. We see the man who shares our spirit. We see the honor that was hidden, and we name it." A great cheer went up. Not from the warriors, but from the townsfolk. Maribel Voss clapped. The blacksmith let out a whoop. The soldiers, even Sergeant Hollis, were smiling. Rowan rose, his body trembling. He felt the wet, cool mark on his brow. He felt whole. For the first time in 3 years, he was not a ghost. He was a man. He turned, and he looked at Dacina. She was smiling, her face luminous, her dark eyes bright with a pride that stole his breath. The cheer, the crowd, the 70 warriors, all of it faded to a distant roar. There was only her, in that moment of public joy. He acted. He stepped forward, his hands coming up to cup her face. He drew her in. He kissed her. It was not the hesitant, exploratory kiss of the cave, nor the tender, healing kiss of the wickiup. This was a kiss of arrival. It was deep, and it was sure, and it was a promise in front of the sun. He poured all the gratitude, all the fear he'd lost, and all the love he'd found into it. And she met him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his, returning the kiss with a fire that was all her own. A second. Louder cheer erupted. She pulled back, but only an inch, her arms still locked around his neck. She rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed, her breath warm. "Home," she whispered, a secret just for him. In the middle of the crowd, home is not a place. Rowan, it is a person. The ceremony was complete. Nantan Tajani approached, his face split by a rare, wide grin. He carried the white, plaited horsehair rein. He handed it to Rowan. "You have done it." Tajani said, "The knot is tied. You are Biondi Daj, the one who leads through the storm. The title is yours, and so is the promise." He swept his hand back toward the 70 warriors, who were now gathering their horses. "From this day, wherever you ride, Rowan hail. Whether to the high peaks or the white man's cities, you do not ride alone. 70 families are the shadow at your back. They are your armor. We are your home." Rowan took the rein. Its weight familiar, its meaning new. He turned and mounted his bay, the horse adorned with the soft feathers of the nest. Dacina mounted her pony beside him. The group, now one, moved. They rode, not as an escort, not as prisoners or saviors, but as neighbors. Rowan, Dacina, and the 70 warriors rode a slow, ceremonial pass along the bank of the Red Comet Wash. The 70 white feathers planted in the bank fluttered in the breeze, a line of pure, unbroken honor. They rode past Palo Verde Station, where Maribel Voss and the blacksmith raised their hands in farewell. They rode past Fort Ransom, where Sergeant Hollis stood on the wall and gave a slow, respectful soldier's salute. They rode on, into the high country, back toward the Red Rocks. They came, finally, to the crest of Whisper Ridge, the place where the story had begun in terror, in the cold gray light of dawn. Rowan stopped his horse. He turned in his saddle, the white rein clutched in his hand. Dacina was beside him, her hand resting on his. On the ridge, the 70 warriors, who had followed them, pulled their ponies into a long, magnificent line. They were not a threat. They were a fortress. Tajani and Kolo sat at the center. Kolo raised his hand, and in a single, silent, powerful gesture, 70 warriors, 70 fathers, 70 men of honor raised their own new, white feathers, holding them high against the blue, endless sky. A salute, a promise, an amen. Rowan Hale, the man who had lost everything, turned his horse. With the woman who was his home, he rode into the future, the shadow of 70 families protecting his back. The love was new, the justice was served, and the covenant of honor, sealed in water and feathers, was unbreakable. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Rowan and Dacina's journey. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like. And if you enjoyed this tale, please hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.